Sadly, as I mentioned, we've seen the deaths of 7 people yesterday. A man in his 90s from Dubbo who died at St Mary's Villa aged care facility, where he acquired the infection, was vaccinated and had underlying health conditions. A man in his 80s from Sydney's inner city died at St Vincent's Hospital. He was not vaccinated and had underlying health conditions. A woman in her 60s from southwestern Sydney died at Campbelltown Hospital. She was not vaccinated. A man in his 80s died in Nepean Hospital. He acquired his infection at the Hawkesbury Living Aged Care Facility in Sydney's northwest. It's the second death, sadly, linked to this outbreak at this facility. He was vaccinated and had significant underlying health conditions. A man in his 90s from southwestern Sydney who died at Liverpool Hospital. He was vaccinated and had underlying health conditions. A woman in her 90s from South Sydney's inner west who died at Concord Hospital was not vaccinated and had underlying health conditions. And a man in his 80s from southwestern Sydney who died at Sutherland Hospital was vaccinated and had multiple underlying health conditions.
Sadly, we report today the deaths of 9 people who had COVID-19. They are a man in his 60s from Western Sydney, a man in his 70s from southeastern Sydney, a woman in her 40s from southwestern Sydney, a man in his 70s from Sydney's southern suburbs, a woman in her 50s from Central Coast, a man in his 60s from Western Sydney, a woman in her 80s, also from Western Sydney, a man in his 30s from Nepean Blue Mountains, and a man in his 50s from southwestern Sydney. All of these individuals had underlying health conditions. 3 were fully vaccinated, 3 had 1 dose of a COVID vaccine, and 3 were unvaccinated.
Sadly, we've had to report 8 deaths of people with COVID in the last 24 hours. I'll just go through those deaths. A man in his 70s from Western Sydney who died at Blacktown Hospital. A man in his 30s from Western Sydney who died at home and was tested positive after his death. A man in his 40s from southwestern Sydney who died at home and tested positive after he died. A man in his 70s from Western Sydney who died at Royal North Shore Hospital. He was had underlying health conditions. A woman in her 80s from Sydney's southern suburbs who died at Sutherland Hospital. A man in his 80s from southwestern Sydney who died at Liverpool Hospital. A woman in her 80s from southwestern Sydney who died at Campbelltown Hospital. And a man in his 50s from Western Sydney who died at Royal North Shore Hospital. As mentioned, none of these people were vaccinated.
In terms of deaths, tragically we've had 5 deaths, and I want to express my condolences to the families. We've got a gentleman in his 80s from northwestern Sydney, died at Nepean Hospital, and he was a resident of the aged care facility in Penrith. This was the first death associated with this outbreak. He had received 2 doses of the COVID vaccine but had serious underlying health conditions. There was a woman in her 70s from Western Sydney, died at Ryde Hospital. She was not vaccinated and also had serious underlying health conditions. A woman in her 70s from Western Sydney died at Concord. She was not vaccinated and also had underlying health conditions. A man in his 80s from Sydney Local Health District died at Westmead Hospital. Again, this gentleman was not vaccinated and had serious underlying health conditions. And a woman in her 40s from southwestern Sydney died at Liverpool Hospital. Again, she was not vaccinated and had serious underlying health conditions.
A man in his 20s who's died with anything for heart attack, so quite young to die from COVID.
That gentleman actually had significant underlying health conditions and was unvaccinated.
Sadly, today we are reporting the deaths of 9 people with COVID-19. They are a man in his 60s from Dubbo who died in Prince Alfred Hospital. He is not vaccinated. He was not vaccinated and had some significant underlying health conditions. We also report the death of a man in his 90s from southeastern Sydney who died at St George Hospital. He was a resident of the St George Aged Care Facility in Bexley, where he acquired his infection, and his death is the 3rd death linked to this aged care facility. We're also reporting the tragic death of a man in his 20s from Western Sydney who died in Nepean Hospital. He was not vaccinated and also had serious underlying health conditions. We are also reporting the death of a man in his 80s from southeastern Sydney who died at Prince of Wales. A woman in her 60s from northwestern Sydney, Agnes Banks, who died at Nepean Hospital. A man in his 70s from Western Sydney who died at St Vincent's Hospital. A man in his 80s from Western Sydney who died at Westmead Hospital. A man in his 70s from southwestern Sydney who died at Liverpool. And a man in his 40s from southwestern Sydney who also died at Liverpool Hospital. 7 of the 9 cases, people who died that we're reporting today were not vaccinated. 1 person had 1 dose and 1 person had 2 doses, and all those individuals had underlying health conditions.
Tragically, there were the death of 8 people who had COVID, and I pass on my sincere condolences to their loved ones. The death of a woman in her 70s from Western New South Wales at Dubbo Hospital was announced yesterday. She was not vaccinated. She had underlying health conditions. There was a gentleman in his 90s from southeastern Sydney died at St George Hospital, and he was not vaccinated and also had underlying health conditions. A man in his 50s from Nepean Blue Mountains died at Nepean Hospital, and he was also not vaccinated. A gentleman in his 90s from southwestern Sydney died at Campbelltown Hospital, and he was a resident of the Advantage Aged Care Facility at Preston's Lodge, and he had acquired his infection there. He was fully vaccinated. He had significant underlying conditions. And there was a woman in her 70s from southwestern Sydney died at Nepean Hospital, and she was not vaccinated. Again, she had significant underlying health conditions. A man in his 70s from southwestern Sydney died at Liverpool Hospital, and he was also not vaccinated. He had significant underlying health conditions. A man in his 80s from Western Sydney died at Westmead Hospital, and he was not vaccinated. He also had underlying health conditions. And a man in his 60s from Nepean Blue Mountains died at home, and he had 1 dose of the COVID vaccine. He had underlying health conditions, and the coroner is going to look into the circumstances around that death. In terms of the deaths, sadly, we have been notified of 5 people who have passed away. A man in his 90s from southeastern Sydney died at St George Hospital, and he was a resident of the St George Aged Care Facility in Bexley and acquired his infection there. He was fully vaccinated, but he had significant underlying conditions. And there was a woman in her 80s from northern Sydney who died at Ryde Hospital. She had received 1 dose of the COVID vaccine, but also had significant underlying conditions. A woman in her 50s from Western Sydney died at Westmead Hospital. She was not vaccinated. And a woman in her 80s from Western Sydney died at Westmead Hospital, and again, she was not vaccinated. And there was a gentleman in his 60s who died. The case has been referred to the coroner. He did test positive after his death through the coronial process, and we're still getting details about that case.
Do you have any further information around the 3 people who sadly died, particularly when they tested positive for COVID?
I may not have it with me, but the people who... I'll just repeat the information I have. A woman in her 50s from Western Sydney who died at Blacktown. She received 1 dose of vaccine and had no obvious comorbidities. A woman in her 70s from southwestern Sydney who died at Campbelltown Hospital. She was not vaccinated and had significant comorbidities. And a man in his 70s from southwest Sydney who died at Liverpool Hospital. He was not vaccinated and had no significant comorbidities.
A gentleman in his 50s from Dubbo died at Dubbo Hospital, and he had significant underlying health conditions. A man in his 70s from Western Sydney died at Westmead Hospital. Again, he also had underlying health conditions. A gentleman in his 70s from Sydney's inner west died at Concord Hospital, and he acquired his infection at the Meredith House Aged Care Facility, and he's the 1st death linked to this outbreak. And there was a woman in her 60s from Western Sydney who died at Westmead Hospital, and she acquired her infection at Cumberland Hospital.
Sadly, today we report the deaths of 12 people in our community. And they are sadly a woman in her 30s from southwestern Sydney who died at home on the 1st of September after being tested on the 31st of August. Investigations are underway into the source of her infection. She was not vaccinated. The second person is a man in his 70s from southeastern Sydney who died at St George Hospital. He was a resident of St George Aged Care Facility in Bexley where he acquired his infection. A woman in her 80s also passed away from southwestern Sydney. A man in his 80s also from southwestern Sydney. A man in his 70s from southwestern Sydney. A woman in her 70s also from southwestern Sydney. Another woman in her 70s from southwestern Sydney. A man in his 70s from Sydney's north who died at Hornsby Hospital. A woman in her 60s from southwestern Sydney. A woman in her 70s from southwestern Sydney who died at Westmead Hospital where she also acquired her infection. A man in his 70s from southwestern Sydney and a man in his 90s from the Blue Mountains died at the Hawkesbury Living Aged Care Facility.
Do we know the vaccination status of all of them?
We do, and we'd be happy to provide that. It's just quite a lot of detail to provide here today, but we'll certainly make that
I guess,
available.
what would you assure people in terms of the majority of them were unvaccinated, or what would be your assurance to people about the efficacy of vaccines and why we saw these 12 deaths today?
Sure. Similar to the deaths that we have reported on other occasions, many of those who died today are older, did have existing comorbidities, and were unvaccinated or had one dose. So it's been a similar pattern to what we previously reported.
Sadly, we had been notified of 7 deaths of people who had COVID-19. A man in his 80s from southwestern Sydney died at Campbelltown Hospital, and he had underlying health conditions and wasn't vaccinated. A woman in her 80s from southwestern Sydney died at Liverpool Hospital. She was not vaccinated. A man in his 70s from southwestern Sydney died at Liverpool Hospital, and he acquired his infection at the hospital and is the 12th death linked to this outbreak. He had received both doses of the vaccination. He did have significant underlying conditions. A man in his 80s from Sydney's North Shore died at Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Hospital, and he acquired his infection at the hospital. He had received both doses of the vaccination, but he had significant underlying conditions. We've got a gentleman in his 50s from southwestern Sydney died at Royal North Shore Hospital. Again, he was not vaccinated and had underlying health conditions. There was a gentleman in his 80s from southwestern Sydney. He died at St George Hospital, and a woman in her 70s from southwestern Sydney who died at Campbelltown Hospital.
As the Premier said, sadly, we report the deaths of 4 people today. They are a woman in her 80s from southwestern Sydney who passed away at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. She was not vaccinated and also had some significant underlying health conditions. We also report the death of a woman in her 60s from Western Sydney who died at Concord Hospital. She was also not vaccinated and also had underlying medical conditions. A woman in her 50s passed away. She was from southwestern Sydney and died at Liverpool Hospital. She was not vaccinated and also had some significant underlying health conditions. A woman in her 70s passed away from southwest Sydney, also at Liverpool Hospital. She was not vaccinated and also had underlying health conditions.
And we extend our deepest condolences to 6 families of loved ones who died from COVID or who had COVID. 3 people in their 80s, 3 people in their 70s, 4 of them were unvaccinated and 2 of them had only had 1 dose of the vaccine. So again, we extend our deepest condolences to the family and loved ones of those 6 individuals.